Interesting.
Welcome to the Lean Mobile Apps Podcast, where we ditch the hype and expose real-life stories that built today's successful startups. From actionable strategies to massive failures to pure kick-ass startup tech, get it all here on the Lean Mobile Apps Podcast. Without further ado, here are your hosts, Monty and Andrea.
Hey, this is Andrea and Monty, and today we're going to talk about Trans-Pacific partnerships. So thank you for joining us, and Monty, you can go ahead and start.
Hey, yeah, I just wanted to make sure. How does it sound? Just out of curiosity, it sounds good. Good. Okay. Yeah, we're going to talk about the Trans-Pacific partnerships, and we want to just continue to go in from a startup perspective about that whole process. And I guess, and Andrea will talk a little bit more about some of the things she just saw recently about the Trans-Pacific partnership getting signed.
Oh yeah, it was signed actually today in Auckland, and there was an expert guest or expert video economist, right, who put out a video which was 2 minutes and 15 seconds, and I can probably share it.
You'll put it in the show notes. Yeah.
Yeah, be sure to do that. But his basic assessment was that the Trans-Pacific partnership was formulated not necessarily in secret, but very quietly to benefit big business. And, immediately when you think about secrecy or privacy or things that are sort of mitigated by the government or mitigated by like very quiet organizations that somehow benefit economically from it, you are frightened. This is the government, this is big business, and then there's us, the regular old folks who have no idea what's going on. But interestingly, I'm in Guam and part of the Pacific, West Pacific, if you will, and we've actually hosted on our island talks or negotiations for the Trans-Pacific Partnership. What took place? No clue. But I think one of my major concerns primarily with Trans-Pacific Partnership, and I think it's going to be something that they address more often now that it's being signed, is the fact that you have this idea that areas in the Pacific that are taking part in Trans-Pacific Partnership are somehow going to, one, take jobs away from Americans in terms of big business, right? And two, produce exports that are unsafe. So I think there is sort of a fear-mongering tactic, and let's not support TPP, one of the largest trade deals in history of mankind, and let's not do it because we are going to eliminate jobs and we are going to take on unsafe imports. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's really interesting from a general perspective, but then kind of getting it to a very narrow scope, because I think a lot of people don't even necessarily know what the Trans-Pacific Partnership, well, forget the partnership, don't know what Trans-Pacific is. And it's really talking about, India, Korea, Japan, Guam, all of that Pacific coast that's sort of directly connected to the Asia region, and how we actually directly engage with that region as part of why they built the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And it's really kind of like NAFTA to some extent, the North American Free Trade Agreement, so that we can actually deal with Canada and to some degree Mexico. This is really saying, how do we engage Asia in this region in a more open and NAFTA-ish way, in my perspective. And that's kind of one of the things that makes it more interesting, because companies are dealing with, Jordan, for example. Most of the Jordans are actually made in China, and then they're imported at a very high premium. But in that area, they're developed and they're built at a very cheap cost. So the Trans-Pacific Partnership is really saying, how is big business really doing this, and how is it going to be impacting the economy, and building sort of a framework around that engagement.
But here's the thing, which kind of bothers me about mass media, and it's probably why a lot of the things are done in private, because there are certain interests, economic interests for different nations. For example, Japan would be agriculture, and the U.S. would be exports, right, or imports, whatnot. So, and I'm not even sure exactly the stakeholders, just that the U.S. is a superpower, so everything concerns the U.S. at this point. But I understand why things are held privately, because propaganda and media can push subjects that are important to different nations to a level where it's sort of like, well, what's in it for us, you know? And if we look at Korea, for example, they pay so close attention to the way they produce fruits, the way they produce the vegetables. I mean, they're literally out there pruning the branches individually to make sure one fruit would grow to a certain proportion. And the care they put in their packaging, you know, is so, it's amazing to me, you know, that fruits come in little styrofoam wrapped up in little boxes and it's all cushioned. That's pretty amazing, right? And then you look at the opposite, which is like throw apples in a bag, you know, in Western culture, and that's good. And I kind of in my mind, I'm sitting and saying, I understand why agriculture is so important to Japan and Korea. And I understand at the same time why it's important to protect those interests privately. And so just like a standard negotiation and agreement in a family, in any situation, you kind of want the people who are stakeholders in that conversation to get the most attention as opposed to media or propaganda or whatnot. So
I'm really even curious if it's getting any propaganda at all on the States. I mean, I know it's probably getting more resonance in the Trans-Pacific area, but in the East Coast, you don't hear a lot of people talking about the Trans-Pacific Partnership, even though it's still going to be impactful across the country. And I think that's very interesting because, I mean, a lot of people will talk about how people outsource and, you know, outsourcing to India. And the Trans-Pacific Partnership has a direct impact on how we outsource and how we outsource to all these different regions, specifically the Philippines, India, and well, you don't really outsource to Japan, but people would then import from Japan. So it's sort of both are directly impacted by this partnership, which we would haven't necessarily talked about.
yeah, I don't know. I think that it's a big concern for the internet. I mean, I personally think it's a big concern for the internet because it affects, I think here's the major concern. We constantly would outsource to, I mean, when I say we, I mean internet marketers in general, you know, online e-commerce, that's sort of jazz, but when I say we, that's what I mean. But we outsource to nations like the Philippines, like India, and it's because of that cost association. So it increases our profit margins and lowers the cost of production, right? So, are you still there?
I'm sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, I guess I'm just standing still. Sorry, go ahead. Don't look at the facial cues.
Okay. So in the outsourcing sense, right, we make more money. But in the respect that we're doing free trade, right, or the Trans-Pacific Partnership, that would change the cost of labor, I'm assuming. So emerging nations or up-and-coming nations would be able to charge more. And interestingly, the Philippines seems to be that type of nation. I mean, they're growing in terms of scale and business-wise. They're growing in terms of economy. I mean, I can see how that's going to change how we outsource. And then opening up the markets in that respect is also going to increase the cost. So I think it's an important thing for the internet to consider.
I think it's that, but I think the pieces that isn't really quite understood about the Trans-Pacific Partnership is that it's making a number of countries, to the best, my best understanding, is really making a number of countries to be all part of one trading bloc. So as opposed to, you know, in Europe, there is sort of the European bloc. You know, they have the euro and that whole approach. This is to some extent building, you know, the U.S., Japan, Malaysia, Vietnam, Singapore, Brunei, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, Mexico, Chile, and Peru, all as one big trading bloc, which accounts for about 800 million people, and 40% of the, you know, all purchasing power comes from this region of people. So it's a really amazing thing, and I think it's partly trying to. Actually, it's more than that group of people. But I think the one thing it's not talking about, and I kind of misspoke before, is China and India. Even though there's an impact there, but it's not really including those two countries because obviously China and India by themselves have over 3.4 billion people. So it's not including those regions, but to some extent, it's really saying let's block this group together so that we actually can compete in that region with those people directly.
But here's the interesting thing about that. China was said, or they're saying that China hasn't necessarily joined the TPP, but what are the real implications of China not joining, and how does that impact them not being a part of the TPP, that trade bloc, right? What is that going to mean in terms of competition?
Well, I think that's the whole point of the TPP. It's really saying we want to be able to compete against China. Like everybody is sort of, if you're not with them, then you're kind of against them. So the question becomes, China is sort of doing their own approach to trade, doing their own approach to business, and they're dealing with things when it comes to their economy totally differently. India has a different process too. I mean, when you really think about it, we're talking about all 12 of these countries together as a trading bloc, which again accounts for 40% of the market. We're saying 800 million people. When you look at Pakistan, not even India, just Pakistan, there's 500 million people in Pakistan. So this entire trading bloc is only a little bit bigger than Pakistan, which is definitely a lot smaller than India. And so again, you look at India and China together are massive trading blocs.
But when I look at India and China, and I compare it to the certain competing nations, I will say this, that quantity and quality is a very significant comparison. I mean, Japan, Samsung, Toyota, these are very high quality sort of industries. They're not necessarily low cost labor in that sense. They're high quality industries. So when I look at quantity versus quality, I can see they're completely, entirely different segments. It's just, I think it was, I can't even remember, but I think it was either Chanel or a high cost, like a high end brand in fashion. And once they asked them, what do you think about bootlegging products, right? And they said, we don't care about that. We don't care about people who buy bootlegged traffic, products, because that's not our market. And we just could care less, So I think in the same respect, it doesn't affect the same consumers, the same industry. That's my thought.
So I think it'll be interesting to see how it actually works out. I mean, when I go back to, like you said, the quality of goods, I know we've talked a lot about the issue of headphones, and I'm wearing these headphones, sort of a test. I prefer. Are you wearing your headphones just out of curiosity? No.
Sure. The great thing is
so clearly you're not wearing the headphones, but the whole thing is I'm really curious because the sound quality is very interesting with these headphones in comparison to not having headphones on and doing this process. Matter of fact, this is a sidebar, but directly related. How's the audio? I mean, it's good, better than usual, the same.
It's pretty good. It's consistent. So, I mean, I'm happy with it.
Okay,
Everything
cool.
is, I can hear you. I can hear complete sentences.
That's a good part. So, but anyway, so the whole point about this is higher quality goods that you would get from Japan, higher quality goods that you get from some of the trade partners. I mean, this whole process is saying, in a NAFTA, in a tariff concept, we will have more easily engaged partnerships with a lot of the Trans-Pacific partners as we build our Trans-Pacific partnership relationship. It's sort of like having that, I don't want to say Samsung and Apple, but it's like most favored nation is what Samsung and Apple have as a relationship. They're competing with each other, but at the same time, they have a direct relationship in that, Samsung basically builds all the iPhones from a base perspective. Yet and still, they don't treat them as if they're a partner. They treat them as if they're kind of the most favored nation, which really means I can't stand you. And this Trans-Pacific partnership concept, it's saying we're going to be most favored partners with Japan and Chile and a lot of the other countries who, to some extent, we compete with. We don't necessarily want Japan to be equal to the U.S., but at the same time, we're saying we want your goods, we want your services, and we want to have a better relationship with you than you have with China. We want to have a better relationship with you than you have with India, and vice versa for all the people that are not a part of this unit. And again, it is in direct correlation to say the European bloc has their partnership, that's why they created the euro, and so we're including again Australia in this component to really say all these people that are in our region are connected to us.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. being here in Guam. That's why it's so fundamentally important. And I know that in the future, very near future, this island is going to play, or this region, the Marianas, is going to play a huge role for the U.S. in terms of how it's, just by way of location and geography. So it becomes a conduit for the Southeast Asia Pacific sort of region. But side note, headphones, where are they made?
These headphones? Great question.
I'm guessing China.
I don't see exactly where they're made.
You see, the interesting thing about the production of goods, right? Being here, that we're here, we have different brands that are sort of commonplace in the U.S., but also sold here. And it's the Asian version of the brand. So it's very funny just to think about the comparison.
It doesn't have anything on it that says where it's made.
They don't want you to know.
Yeah, exactly. That's a statement in and of itself.
That's just a side note, but it's a very big consideration. So imagine on your shelves Japanese products made by, for women, Kotex.
Right.
Or, and that is a reality here on Guam. There are products that are made for specific markets. And to see them more widely available will be very interesting. How we can sort of assess the quality of it in comparison to what we would see in the US.
More widely available and more readily recognizable. Because, again, just like with these headphones, and I'm actually looking at a lot of the equipment I have, it doesn't necessarily say made in China or made in India or made in Milan. It doesn't say any of that. I think if it was made in the U.S., it would probably prominently say made in the U.S., but it says none of that. So that makes me say it's from one of those places. But I thought there was a reason. I thought there was a time where they had to say this is made in China or this is made in India. I don't really know. I don't know what changed.
If it's made in Guam, if something is produced in Guam, we have to have the Guam seal saying made in Guam.
But if you export it from Guam, does it have to still have the Guam seal?
No. If you export it from Guam, then no, not necessarily. But that's sort of a gray area. If you export it or if you create it, if it's made in Guam, then it should have the seal.
Yeah.
But how would you export it?
Well,
how would you export it?
Case in point, Guam and Japan. For right now, there's no Trans-Pacific Partnership. I guess maybe there is, or I'm not really sure. But right now, there's no Trans-Pacific Partnership. Guam is 3 hours, or is it 5 hours from Japan?
A little more. I think 3 by plane, a little bit.
Okay. So 3 hours from Japan. You make something in Guam, and Japan wants it. Maybe it's a Pokemon. But you just, obviously they have Pokemon, but you create the coolest Pokemon T-shirt in the whole wide world, and it's made in Guam, and you export that to Japan. Does it now have to have the made in Guam seal?
Yes.
Okay.
If something is made physically here on island, it has to have the seal on it. Even if it's food for sale, like packaged jarred food, like barbecue sauce, for instance, it would have to have the seal on it. Not necessarily code, because code is an export. Interesting. So if you export code from Guam, you are susceptible to the taxes. Code.
Yeah,
how would you track? This is my conversation with the business development. It's like, how would you track exporting code? Realistically, they're like, well, we could audit your statements and so. And I'm like, but realistically, how are you going to track my export of coding? Like, realistically.
The only way I could see you could track the code, well, truth be told, you can track it by your IP address. So if your IP address, the actual IP address that created the code, you can actually then say this is originated in this particular region. And that's why a lot of hackers who don't necessarily match their IP addresses get caught, because you're able to then say, okay, well, your IP address is this is exactly where you are. And because you're in that particular region based on these 3 codes and these 3 codes, I know your exact zip code. And I know which device you did it on. It was on a tablet, or it was on a this, or it was on a that. Like, that code is basically giving your full address in more detail than your street address, because it's really getting it down to your specific device, the specificity of your device and the region your device is in.
I'm not talking about code that's sort of live on the internet. I'm talking about code that I send in a zip file to somebody who buys it from me. How do you track that? Because they paid you $500?
It really some of the code that you actually can build will then, it's sort of like, and this is old school, but kind of, I guess, new school does it the same way. When you write the code in some of the blank systems, it'll ultimately say authorship. And with that authorship, it comes an entire tag of who did, when, where, why, and how. But
okay.
unless you keep it in a flat file, if you keep it in a flat file that has nothing in it, then yeah, you can't track.
That's what I'm saying.
Oh, okay.
I mean, not that you would do that, but I'm just saying realistically, how would they track that? And why would they, how would they track it?
Well, they want to track it based on, it's a sidebar, but they want to track it based off of the idea of if it's malicious code. So you created the worm virus. I mean,
and if I created that, I wouldn't be found. So let's just be honest. Like, if I created that virus, if I did that, I mean, now that I can't. So I can't do that.
Right.
Be clear. Okay,
That is going to be interesting how and why and when they would actually track code and how, because that's really, it's the technology. I mean, again, going back to the hackathon, which I'm sure you'll speak to in a second. I think the idea of engaging technology of people in Japan, of people in Chile, of people in Australia. Like, Australia's the most interesting place to me because from a marketer stance, it's one of the best places you actually want to market. They buy almost any and everything.
Going to Australia. Did I tell you? I'm sorry.
Who is?
My little brother.
Oh, yeah. That's pretty awesome. How far is it?
He's going to Nerd. Well, I think it's 18 hours for him.
Oh, wow.
But
that's awesome.
My thought was, why are you going to Australia? Like, we live near there, and it's the same environment. He's like, I just want to go. I love the Philippines. Yeah.
It's a great place to go to, especially if you just want to learn. It's like going to a foreign country, but they don't really speak something that's too foreign of a language.
So it's easy to sort of fit in and assimilate in the culture.
One person I know, they have an HR expertise. This is the most interesting story I know. Well, not true, but one of the most interesting stories I know. The person has an HR expertise, and they wanted to do international business. And what they actually, their challenge was they speak no other languages. So it's like, how do you do international business if you speak no other languages? Well, the first thing you can actually go to is London. So that's what they did. They did international business in London. And now they have an exceptional job at a great company. And they're like the head of some part of their HR, which they deal with the region, which is like the US and Canada. So they're still dealing with a country that speaks English. Matter of fact, the company's based in UK. They're based in the U.S., and they're sort of dealing with the region of the U.S. and Canada, all the while they have to go to UK periodically. So they're doing exactly what they said in the international business region, just without being able to speak Chinese, Japanese, or any of that kind of crap.
It's not crap.
No, trust me, I love speaking, konnichiwa and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, practice. Languages, being multilingual is a difficult thing, especially, I can speak 2 languages pretty well. I can speak English very well, clearly, right? But, being multilingual is a benefit and a struggle at the same time because it has a lot to do with identity. Even in your culture, there is a certain language. And I wouldn't necessarily understand, not, the King's English, but I'm talking about, sort of culturally.
Gotcha.
So there are different concepts, and I think, and this is why, going back to TPP, this is why I think, and they're making a big deal about it being held in secret, and I don't think necessarily that much of it is secret, it's just private. And if you understand the dynamics of different cultures, especially in Asia, it's a very different culture in language and belief and communication. And because of that, it's, I think, less open. And I think that's very difficult in terms of, the general public to understand and relate to that because we're all about, in America, transparency and free speech. And you understand what I'm saying? But in the different cultures, Asia, it's not necessarily like that. It's very quiet and sort of like this understood form of communication, just like we were speaking about a few days ago, or maybe last week, the Hiragi.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So it's a very sort of silent culture, I think.
The Hiragi is very interesting to me, and like I think that's one of the things we'll probably talk about in one of the next podcasts, because it's something that, I mean, going back to the whole point of how it's directly related to Mushi Mushi, I think Hiragi is really, really amazing when it's properly managed and understood. But that's on a whole different level.
Okay, so I think that's it. That's all we have for today, and we will be back for more talks on the Trans-Pacific Partnership and everything that has anything to do with tech and startups, because we're in love with that.
Yep.
So be sure to subscribe and visit our site for show notes. We'll put the information out so you can take a look and view the details.
Yep.
Thanks for joining us.
All right, cool. The outro.
We love our podcast listeners. To reach us with questions and more resources, go to leanmobileapps.com/speakpipe.